Good afternoon. My name is Yi Huang. I'm a faculty at the Graduate Institute of Geneva and greeting from Beijing. Today, we are very glad to have Professor Heiwai Tang, the expert for trade and China, and again, expert for Hong Kong as well, to present his recent work about science and trade. Professor Tang did his PhD from MIT. Previously, before he joined Hong Kong U, he was a professor and still on leave from Science Johns Hopkins. And Professor Tang wrote a lot of interesting paper at the AER top journal about the trade, global supply chain. And today, he's also very kind, try to not only present his recent work about the SARS, what happened in Hong Kong, what happened to trade in China. Also, he wants to provide his insight, some preliminary work about the COVID-19. I think Professor Tang can give us a lot of insights, not only for one paper, but multiple papers. I'm very glad, and as he's a friend and co-authors and admire, a big fan of his work. Professor Tang, you have 40 minutes and in Hong Kong, and then you have a Q&A. And I hope, and I'll try to organize also participants of the question you can share at the chat room. In the end, we have Q&A sections. Then Professor Tang can organize all questions systematically to answers. Okay, now sky is not floor, sky is yours, Professor Tang.
Thank you so much, Professor Huang, for the kind introduction. Let me share the screen. Can everyone see that? Professor Huang,
yes.
Can you confirm? Can you see it?
Yes,
all right.
I can see that, yes.
So it's my great pleasure to have the opportunity to present this new paper joined with Anna Fernandez from the University of Exeter that is about the impact of SARS in 2003 on Chinese trade, both import and export. So this seminar series is about COVID-19 as well as real-time research, but I have to say this is more like a historical research rather than a real-time research. Towards the end of the presentation, I do have some real-time data and real-time analysis that is related to the impact of COVID-19 on Chinese trade, but that is still very preliminary. As we know, most of the data on the trade side are still coming out from individual customs departments. So we don't have much to say about the current event yet, but we are able to see some preliminary results. But most importantly, in the next 35 minutes, I'm just going to talk about the 2003 SARS experience and what kind of lessons we can draw from that episode in shedding light on the current events. So as a sort of overall motivation, the world has gone through two trade collapses since 2008 global financial crisis. The first one obviously happened in 08-09 when global export dropped by 13% in 1 year. Since then, trade grew at a much slower pace. Okay, this is something that we should watch out for in the next few years when trade finally recovered from the current collapse. So people have been talking about the global trade slowdown since the previous financial crisis. And the official definition is that after 2010, with a very strong rebound in exports, global exports has been growing at around 3% per year compared to over 7% growth per year between the early 90s all the way to 2008. So the chart that I put in this slide is from the WTO, which did a forecast in April this year. They have very pessimistic forecasts predicting that in this year, trade is going to collapse in the worst case scenario by 32%. Most recently, there was an update literally just 2 days ago by the WTO, and they realized that the drop in exports in Q2 this year was only about 18.5. So what it means is that only if the following 2 quarters we're going to drop more than 20%, closer to 30%, we are not going to have the worst case scenario being realized. So therefore, I guess the original concern about a much bigger collapse in trade compared to the previous crisis was a bit too pessimistic. Okay, so that said, obviously we're going to see a large drop in both import and export between developing and developed countries and essentially across the world. And given the sort of second or third wave of the infections that we have seen in the US, other advanced economies, and especially in the Southern Hemisphere, it is too early to say that the worst is over. But since the world is still sort of going through the crisis and that the trade data for the most recent time were not available, so what we can do as trade economists is to look for a very similar situations that is related to a health shock to the world, which also disrupted global supply chains and also business travels for a short period of time. So the kind of questions that we would like to answer, given all the uncertainty that we are facing, is A, how severe is the 2020 trade collapse is going to be? As I said, the WTO may be a bit too pessimistic, but it is still possible that the second half of the year, trade is still going to grow very weakly, and therefore it is still possible that the trade collapse is going to be larger than the previous one that we had around 13 years ago. Another question that is important, especially for people who are interested in studying the restructuring of global supply chains, is to understand what sectors or what kind of products are going to be most affected. The third one, which I'm going to highlight a lot in the current presentation, is to understand the heterogeneous effect across firms. What kind of firms are going to be most affected? What kind of firms are more likely to survive the pandemic? And what kind of firms are going to thrive or drive recovery after the current pandemic is going to be over? So as I have said multiple times, we're going to look at one specific episode, which is the 2003 severe acute respiratory syndrome, in short, SARS, that has hit different regions in China, in Asia, in 2002, 2003, in order to shed light or provide some insight to answering the questions that I just listed. And the research design is very simple, right? So there's no rocket science. This is probably the simplest possible paper that you have seen in this webinar series. We are just going to use very simple difference and difference regressions in order to compare firms' trade performance in regions that are hit by SARS relative to other firms in the unaffected regions in China. The beauty of this paper is the duration of the health shock is very short, so therefore we'll be able to understand the abrupt drop in trade as well as the rapid recovery right after the end of the epidemic. So you may ask, why do we use SARS as even a close benchmark to understand what's going on in today's world, given the very different natures between SARS and COVID-19? And I would provide the following three reasons to convince you why you should still understand the impact of SARS in order to forecast what is going to happen in a post-pandemic world. The first one, the first similarity between SARS and COVID-19 is, during the peak of SARS in China, business travels and all kinds of travels were heavily disrupted. Okay, it is very similar to the experience that we have right now, right? So many of us are still staying home, and there are always like second and third or fifth waves coming out, discouraging people to travel or even go out to interact with others. So very similar situation happened in China in 2002, 2003, which disrupted not only business activities, but also international trade and new business creation, okay? So the fact that it is equally strong in terms of disrupting activities is a good benchmark for us to shed light, to use SARS to shed light on COVID-19. You may also ask, why to use SARS as a benchmark, given that SARS only affected China and certain countries in Asia, but not the rest of the world? So this is exactly the strength that we like about using SARS as a benchmark, because we can basically categorize firms into the treatment groups versus the control groups, right? So imagine you try to do a similar experiment or analysis using the current pandemic as an experiment, it will be very hard to basically categorize regions or countries or economies or even firms into sort of treatment versus control groups, because in the end, all individuals, all businesses, and all countries are affected at different times of the year and also exposed to different extent to the pandemic. Okay, so we actually like the fact that we have very local experiments given the local nature of SARS. The third one, or the third reason why SARS is a beautiful benchmark is it only lasted for about half a year. For certain regions in China, it lasted for almost a year. So therefore, we will have a long enough time series to understand the recovery process, which we are not able to do given the current situation, because we are still far from the recovery. Okay, so let me move on to talk about the baseline results. So we are using firm-level transaction trade data to do the difference and difference regressions. And we find that firms in regions with local transmission experience on average an 11% additional decline in trade growth during the peak of the epidemic in 2003. Okay, it's a pretty large relative decline in trade growth. We also find significant extensive margins adjustment for firms in regions that are exposed to SARS. They tend to have a much higher exit rates. For exports, firms in those regions had an average 0.6 percentage point higher probability of exit from exporting. Okay. Right after the end of SARS, we realized a very strong and significant recovery measure in terms of average firm export and import growth, as well as aggregate export and import growth. But interestingly, and this is in contrast to many anecdotal evidence or preliminary analysis that people have done in 2003, by the end of 2005, we are talking about 2 years after the end of the crisis, the firms in regions that are exposed to SARS still experience a significantly lower import and export growth. In particular, they experience a 4 percentage point lower export growth compared to firms in the unaffected regions. And in terms of import, firms that are affected experience on average a 6 percentage point lower import growth in 2005. So therefore, we argue that even though the recovery was very strong, but there seems to be a very medium run effect of SARS on firms' trade performance in China. Okay. So let me spend 5 minutes to talk about the background of SARS and what is sort of the background that we rely on for our analysis. SARS was the first infectious coronavirus in the 21st century. We have the second one, which is the Middle East respiratory syndrome, and the third one that is the current coronavirus. It infected over 8,000 people, which is a much smaller number compared to today's numbers. My most updated numbers is over 11 million people were already infected by coronavirus today. It killed over 700 people globally. Most of them are concentrated in Asia, in particular China, and also Hong Kong. So you can imagine that SARS is much less infectious, but it's a lot more deadly, right? So it's much less like people are much less likely to get it, but conditional on getting it, they are a lot more likely to die. And at the end of the epidemic, epidemiologists estimated that the death rates of SARS is around 9.2, which I'm sure is going to be much higher than the death rate of COVID-19. So SARS broke out in China at the end of 2002 and essentially ended in the third quarter of 2003, according to the World Health Organization. So as I've said, despite the very small number of infections and the short duration and the local nature of SARS, why are we still interested in using this as an analysis or as a reference point for COVID-19? First, it essentially halted business travels and activities for over 2 years in 2003 for China. So there's no official number about how international travels were disrupted, but if Hong Kong is a good reference point, we can imagine that at the peak of the epidemic, which is April and May 2003, international travels dropped by close to 70% in April and May. Compared to the same month in the previous year. Research has shown that business travels are very important for business creations. Face-to-face interactions are still very important for enforcement of contracts and also for essentially delivery of high-quality intermediate inputs. So therefore, you can imagine, disruption of business travels will have short and even medium-term impact on trade. Perhaps specific to China, the following two discussions are important. First, there's an annual trade conference, so not the one that academics go to, but the one that businessmen and women attend every year in Guangdong. As of now, on average, there are around 200,000 business travelers attending the so-called Canton Import and Export Fair, which was organized every spring of the year. This year, it was moved online. I was told that the results were actually quite good. But in 2003, before internet or webinar or Zoom were even developed, the Chinese government just decided to cancel the Canton Trade Fair. So you can imagine, a lot of the businesses that were supposed to happen did not materialize because they couldn't sign the contract in Guangdong. Another discussion which I would like to highlight, and people should try to get some relevant data to understand whether this is true, is the emergence of e-commerce were essentially triggered by the collapse of trade in the beginning of 2003. There are a lot of anecdotal evidence, including many journalistic reports about why Jack Ma and Alibaba would become so prominent in China since 2003. But in terms of real economic impacts, at that time, there are researchers like Yiping Huang at Peking University and co-author who already estimated that, in the second quarter of 2003, China's GDP essentially contracted by 5%. Luckily, the recovery was strong. So at the end, China's GDP was only 0.5% lower than the previous year. But you can imagine at the peak of the crisis, people were in a similar panic mode as many people were in today. All right. So this is a map showing you sort of the outbreak and the spread on the geographic distribution of SARS in 02 and 03. So they happened in Guangdong in December 2002. They quickly spread to Hong Kong and also the northern part of China. In the first quarter of 03, you have Inner Mongolia and Shanxi having their first outbreak. And then in the second quarter of 2003, you had important regions like Beijing and Shanghai also experience a significant increase in infections. So the map basically told you one thing, which is, there is an interesting geo distribution and time series variation in terms of when SARS were affecting different regions of China. And at the same time, not only the southern part of China was affected, you also have places like Shanghai or the northeastern part of China, which specialize in different kinds of production that will give us, interesting variation in firms' characteristics as well as product characteristics for us to understand what kind of products or what kind of firms are likely to be affected and how the recovery is coming along. Okay. All right. So as I have told you, this is really like undergraduate econometrics. We are just doing difference and difference regressions. On the left-hand side, the dependent variable is the change in firm F's log quarterly trade, which can be import or export by the firm, from region R, which is either a province or a municipality city like Beijing, Shanghai, compared to the same quarter in the previous year. Okay, so the log difference is essentially an annual difference, but we are using quarterly data in order to smooth out some of these seasonalities, including the different timing of the Lunar New Year in China. On the right-hand side is even simpler. We are basically putting just one dummy, which got turned on when SARS hit a particular region R in a given quarter. All right. So SARS dummies will be all equal to 0 in 2002, except Guangdong. But then it will turn on to be 1 for certain regions like Beijing and Shanghai in the second quarter of 03. And we also control for quarter and year fixed effect, as well as the log export volume of the firm F. Okay. So in terms of the structure of the panel, we have to understand that we have a relatively short panel in order to understand the medium run effect and also the short run impact. The pre-treatment period is essentially the first 3 quarters in 2001 to 02. The epidemic period is essentially the first 3 quarters when some regions in China were affected. The recovery period, which I'm going to show you later, is the 8 quarters in 2004 and 2005 compared to 4 quarters in 2002. Okay, so we're going to run the regression separately for the epidemic period, and then we are going to repeat the same analysis for the recovery period. Okay, later on we're going to add product and country dimensions. You can imagine you can put more subscript on both the left hand and the right hand sides in order to think about more granular variation, but for now just focus on the firm variation. As I have said, data is for all the trade transactions of Chinese firms, and we got the data from China's customs. I'm sure many people who have studied Chinese trade have a copy in their hard drive now. So this is just a graph, showing you perhaps some surprising results. All right, so what we do is a slight variation of the specification that I told you earlier. The dependent variable is an annual log difference in export value at the firm product country level, right? So we already started using more granular data in plotting this graph. On the right-hand side, instead of having a SARS dummy, we basically have a dummy for any regions that were ever affected at the beginning of 2003. Okay, so basically we are trying to trace the entire time series of the regions that were affected compared to the regions that were not affected, and we're looking at the average firm effects and using a very granular transaction level data. Okay, and we control for the time fixed effect by simply putting a post 2003 dummy on the right hand side. So what you can see is that first, for firms that are affected eventually, there doesn't seem to be a pre-trend, right? It's not like those regions were already experiencing some decline in exports. But when SARS hit those regions in time 0, in quarter 1 after the regions were hit, quarter 2 after it was hit, and quarter 3 it was hit, there were a substantially lower export growth compared to other firms in the unaffected regions. But about a year after the beginning of the epidemic, which you see quarter 4 here, there was a substantial rebound or substantial catch-up for the firms that were affected. We are talking about 5 percentage point higher growth in quarter 4 or the 4th quarter after the beginning of the epidemic for the affected firms. And the higher export growth persisted for around 1.5 years until sort of the beginning of 2005, which is essentially the 9th quarter for most of the regions after quarter 0. Then we see actually lower export growth for the firms that were affected. Okay, so the last 3 dots in this graph are basically what I argue as a negative medium run effect for the firms that were affected by SARS. Okay, so obviously I'm going to tell you, why there will be a medium run effect. We don't have a model. We are considering to build one, but given that this is a real-time research, we realize that we should report this sort of reduced form results as fast as we can. So basically, by the end of 2005, firms that were affected by SARS were growing at around 4 percentage points lower than the firms of similar characteristics that were not affected. Similar patterns were found for import. All right, so the import recovery was even stronger, about 1 year after the beginning of SARS, and then also around 2 years after SARS, firms were experiencing lower import growth compared to firms that were not affected. By the end of 2005, firms' import growth were around 6 percentage points lower than those that were not affected. All right, so let's move on to the regressions. Okay, so the observations for this table are basically at the firm quarter level. Okay, and the dependent variable once again is basically annualized log change in export, essentially export growth. In panel A and in the lower panel, we have import growth as well. We control for some firm characteristics and also year-quarter fixed effect. So the SARS dummies are mostly negative and significant, or actually all negative and significant for all the regressions that we have here. In column 1, we look at the intensive margin in terms of average firms export growth. In the second one, we look at the firm's export varieties growth. The third one is firm's destination countries growth. And the last one is essentially a dummy for whether the firm exits or not right after the epidemic started in the region. So basically, firms were growing on average at around 11 percentage points lower than other firms that were not affected. Much smaller magnitude were found in terms of varieties and also in terms of the number of destinations. Firms were more likely to exit from importing, but they are less likely to exit from importing. Okay, so intuitively, it may not be surprising, right? When there is disruption in supply chains, factories were asked by the government to shut down, and you have disruption of local traffics. Firms cannot produce, and they have to rely on import, right? So in some sense, the fact that we see firms that are less likely to exit from importing is consistent with the idea that firms are shifting from sourcing domestically to sourcing more internationally. Okay, so let's look at the heterogeneous effect. What kind of firms are more likely to exit? In the upper panel, we have the same structure, but we add an interaction term between the SARS dummy and also some indicators for firm characteristics. In column 1, we look at above median size firms within an HS2 industry. What we find is that conditional on survival, larger firms are growing slower during the epidemic quarters in China. The second column, which says EP, means export processing, which are firms that essentially import most of the intermediate inputs, firms that recruit mostly low-skill, low-paid workers to assemble most of the foreign inputs and just ship them out for fast consumption. Those firms tend to be labor-intensive, tend to be large, and they also experience a stronger decline. Sorry, I kept saying growth, but it is actually exit. So they are less likely to exit. So the first column obviously is about large firms are less likely to exit. In the third column, we find that foreign firms are less likely to exit. And finally, in the last column, we have SOEs, which stand for state-owned enterprises. So state-owned enterprises are more likely to exit. Okay, so you may be surprised, given the current environment, you may think that state-owned enterprises usually are protected by the government. But during that sample period, the government is heavily engaged in privatization right after China's joined the WTO. So it could be possible that the Chinese government didn't have a lot of incentives to save the SOEs during the epidemic. But essentially, the first columns are consistent with our priors that larger firms, foreign firms are more likely to survive. In the lower column, we find consistent but opposite signs on the interaction terms. Remember, firms are less likely to exit from importing, but they're more likely to do so if they are large, if they are processing firms, and if they are state-owned enterprises. What it means is that larger firms probably are more able to shift to domestic sourcing, and they probably have built up some inventories. So therefore, when the epidemic hit, they didn't need to sort of retrieve to foreign suppliers, and therefore they're more likely compared to smaller and domestic firms to exit from importing intermediate inputs. Okay. So after talking about the extensive margin, which is about firm entry and exit in trade activities, we can look at the intensive margin, which is essentially about import and export growth. In the upper panel, we have the same set of firm characteristics that we have visited, and now we're going to revisit them as sort of shaping the heterogeneous patterns of epidemic export growth. So the first column is basically repeating what we have done, but now at a more granular level of disaggregation, we have observations that at the firm, product, country, quarter level. Despite the fact that firms are more likely, firms are growing slower during the epidemic, we find that foreign firms, which you can see in column 4, are suffering relatively less. And we have larger firms conditioned on survival that are growing, interestingly, even slower compared to smaller firms. In column 3, we have processing firms that are growing even slower. And then the last column, we have state-owned enterprises that are growing even slower, conditioned on survival. So, the takeaway from this table, along with the previous one, is that large firms are more likely to survive, but conditioned on survival, they're growing slower, which is exactly the same point that I'm going to highlight when I talk about the recovery process. At the lower panel, we have consistent patterns in terms of import growth, right? Larger firms are growing slower in imports during the epidemic. The same for SOEs, the same for processing firms. If anything, foreign firms are more resilient in dealing with the epidemic, partly because they can sort of maintain their business and trade channels relatively better compared to some independent domestic companies in China. Okay, so just when you are a bit tired of seeing all these coefficients, I'm going to show you even more that we can look at, given the nature of the data, heterogeneous effects across product characteristics. The focus here is export growth at the firm, product, country level. And we find that more substitutable products are likely to suffer more. Consumption goods, as you can see in column 3, are going to suffer more during the epidemic. Capital goods, upstream input, capital intensive and skill intensive goods that you can see from column 3, 5, 6, and 7 appear to be more resilient. All right. So this is an interesting part that I want to, well, maybe I should wait later to talk about, how China is different today compared to 2003, given that China is a lot more specialized in the goods that are more resilient in 2003. We can also imagine that China in this particular episode, all else equal, are going to be more resilient in 2002 in terms of its trade performance. So based on this data, you can easily imagine a model with different elasticity of substitution for inputs and final goods to basically understand why certain goods are less affected compared to others. And when we try to understand the recovery path, and this heterogeneity is going to play equally important roles in driving the results. In terms of imports, again, more substitutable products that you can see in column 1 suffer more, and we also see imported inputs also experience a larger decline. And part of the reason is, when you have factories shut down, firms are not going to buy inputs from abroad because they are not going to employ the workers to put things together. At the same time, when we see less upstream inputs being exported abroad, we also see less upstream import into China, right? So basically, the upper parts of the supply chains somehow were less affected. Again, today may be different, given that the crisis are associated with both demand and supply shocks. And here in 2003, we are focusing mostly on the supply shock that disrupt Chinese trade. Okay, so how about the recovery? So essentially the same sort of regressions, but what we have right now is 2004, 2005, quarterly trade growth compared to the baseline firm performance, which are annual export and import growth in 2002 compared to 2001. So what you can see here is conditional survival. Large firms are growing slower during the recovery path. And same for processing firms, as you can see in column 4. But then we don't see more significant evidence, for other firm types. In terms of import growth, large firms are importing less in terms of growth in 2004 and 5. Same for processing firms. And SOEs become less dependent on imports, while foreign firms become more dependent on imports, right? So I don't have a universal model to explain all the coefficients, but basically one takeaway from this graph is, from this table is, similar to the previous one, large firms are more likely to survive, but on average they're growing slower, which may be the reason for why overall growth of Chinese trade and also average firm growth of Chinese trade were slowed down in regions that were affected by the epidemic. All right, so let me not talk too much, because I realize you probably will have a very clear idea about all this already. So the takeaway from all these results is large and processing exporters, many of them being foreign owned, are more likely to survive. This sort of reallocation of resources, you may say, basically drive the patterns of post-epidemic growth, right? Because large and processing firms are growing slower, driving down the growth rates of exports in regions that are affected. But the silver lining is, given that China has been sort of moving up the value chains, the specialization in capital-intensive, skill-intensive, and upstream products have helped them to basically survive the epidemic in 2003 and thrive after the post-epidemic periods. Okay, so I promise you I will spend about 5 minutes to talk about some preliminary results based on some trade data that I can download from the official website of China's customs. So the first thing is the recovery of exports from China has been very strong, right? So you can see there was a big collapse in January, February this year in exports. We are talking about like over 20 to 25% of export decline compared to the same month in previous year. But then since the return of factories and the strong incentives provided by both the local and central governments to restart manufacturing, in May 2020 this year, which is the most updated data that we can get from their website, we're already talking about essentially the same level of exports, or close to the same level of exports as of last year. You can see a lot of seasonality, right? So, but don't worry about it. When we run regressions, we're going to use quarterly data. So therefore, all this seasonality due to a different timing of the Chinese New Year will be absorbed by the quarter fixed effect, or by the fact that we aggregate the data to the quarter level. So this is a graph showing you the growth rates at the annualized basis rather than at the dollar values. And you see that there's a sharp V-shaped recovery of Chinese export up to May 2020. In about a week, we will be able to get the June data from the website, and I'm going to repeat essentially the same set of analysis that we have done for SARS 2003. So just when many people were happy about the recovery of trade in China, and it is sort of interesting to see that a lot of the recovery was actually driven by relatively low end and less sophisticated goods, right? So the orange bar shows you a substantial decline in exports in Q1 2020, and the blue bars show you continuous decline in exports for certain products like leather and electronics. But then on the right hand side, you see for certain product categories like animal and vegetables, beverages, textile products. These are all low end stuff, right? basically those are the products that are driving the recovery in April and May this year. Okay. But that didn't stop us from sort of digging deeper, right? Because we do have the HS6 category of all these products. Because it's too early to run any analysis, regression analysis. But what we can do is basically look at different product categories in terms of the collapse in trade in Q1 2020 and the recovery in April, May 2020. So what you can see here is basically the same set of results that is highly consistent with what I have shown you based on SARS 03. So the highly elastic goods may be the only exception that it seemed to grow even in Q1, and we didn't see any significant difference in terms of a recovery speed in April and May. But then we continue to see that consumption goods are collapsing more during the peak of the epidemic in China, and the recovery was slow. Capital goods, capital intensive and skill intensive goods tend to drive the recovery similarly for R&D intensive products. Okay, so let me conclude. I guess we're still sort of far away from drawing very precise lessons from the SARS experience, but it's sort of interesting to notice that no one has done it, and I realize I should at least put those numbers on a paper to allow people to think about perhaps more structural and deeper analysis. The major takeaway is that the recovery was very fast, which was mostly driven by large firms that survived, which was mostly driven by sophisticated products. If there is one surprise is after 2 years of the epidemic, affected firms are still growing slower in their trade performance. There are lots of caveats, such as China is very different today compared to 15 years, 17 years ago. It is less dependent on labor-intensive processing export, a lot more specialized in upstream, sophisticated intermediate input. Good news, according to our results, is there will be less disruption, from the perspective of China in terms of trade. But the bad news is there will be more disruption because goods produced by Chinese firms are less substitutable. So you're going to get more propagation of negative shocks across the world, even without the negative demand shocks that we have seen in advanced economies. So there could be more interesting future research. As I've said, I have been downloading custom data from the website. In a few weeks, I will be putting a similar paper using the current data studying the impact of COVID-19 on Chinese exports. Someone who is more structurally trained than me should try to write down a structural model to think about the reorganization of supply chains and the substitution of inputs and final goods between different regions in China or between different countries as source countries. But anyhow, I think it is interesting through the lens of trade models to understand how a health crisis will affect economic restructuring given our medium-run results. So Professor Huang, that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Heiwai Tang, and excellent research. And I think I have some questions. Let's look at the first question from Professor Paul Andrews.
Yeah, so I'm reading his question. I'm surprised that he woke up so early. It is, I mean, a lot of the results that I show here are probably lower bounds. You are right, because as I've said, the shocks are a lot more local, affecting only the supply side in China, and now you have demand shocks everywhere. Given the more complicated supply chains, Paul, you're the expert on this. You must understand, how the propagation will come back and affect some of the supplies in China as well. So I would say yes, most of the coefficients that I show you here are lower bounds, but they are precisely estimated given the precise and local nature of the shocks.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, if there are no questions, yes, sir.
I have a question.
Yes.
Thanks for the great presentation. So I was interested by your result about exit of state-owned firms. There is this idea that the Schumpeterian idea that crisis might have a cleaning effect and eliminate, less productive firms. And so we have a new CEPR ebook that's discusses this thing, we don't find much evidence. But in this case, if you think that state-owned firms are less productive than non-state-owned firms, it seems to go in this direction. And I was wondering if you explore this more in details by looking at more productive and less productive firms, which would go along with your last bullet about structural changes. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I am with you that the epidemic or the current pandemic, like any kind of financial crisis, are going to have some sort of cleansing effect, especially when the government is not behind to bail out some of the companies. During that period of time, the Chinese government actually has incentive to privatize or even let go some of the state-owned enterprises. And you're right that on average, during that period of time, state-owned enterprises are less productive compared to non-state companies. And all these findings were consistent with the fact that small firms are less likely to survive. I'm not saying that small firms are necessarily less productive, but they probably are more budget constrained. So therefore, the strong firms, regardless of how you measure it, are more likely to survive. But conditional survival, they may gain monopoly power, they may charge higher markups, and they may dominate, in both the capital and labor markets. So therefore, it is possible that compared to the counterfactual, if there's no epidemic, there could be less dynamic in the post-epidemic or the current post-pandemic world. So obviously, I don't want to sort of exaggerate, the macro implications based on trade data, but I am expecting, after the pandemic, there will be an increased firm concentration in certain economies in the world.
Can I ask a question, Heiwai? So we all know this time is different. So besides Professor Pawan just mentioned about the short-term versus long-term compared to SARS and current COVID-19. So two another factor, also flavors, also might make your result, more apparent. Number one is policy response. So now we have more in terms of every country economy have a lockdown policy. Number two is after China joined WTO, as you mentioned, China more exposure to international trade. So you emphasize a lot in terms of export. So what happened to import? For example, a lot of foreign country import a lot for Chinese medical equipment goods, like masks, everything, also commodities. So I would like to learn a little bit more from these two perspectives. Number one, policy response compared to before. And number two, what happened to import? Thank you. And Professor Poan just have another question. Maybe he can ask the questions.
Yeah, so Yi, very good questions. Again, I think we're still far away from connecting, the set of results that I just discussed with the current event. Of course, in order to squeeze this paper into the series, I have to shed some light. I think there are substantial differences between the nature of the pandemic and SARS. Also, there's a substantial difference between China 2003 and China today. So what I can say, given the firm level difference and difference results, is if you allow me to sort of control for all the demand shocks and just think about how China is going to recover from its own supply restrictions, then we're going to see that given the specialization in upstream and sophisticated products, we are going to see stronger recovery from Chinese trade, again, given the control of the demand shocks. But perhaps your question is related to a much larger and more policy relevant discussion that I'm actually working on for the Asian Global Institute here at Hong Kong U, which is how would global value chain look like in the post-pandemic world? I think we have seen many news about countries' government, trying to encourage their own national firms to come back and rely less on China. And the epidemic have revealed to many countries' businesses and governments that they have relied too much on China on essential products like medical supplies, as you said, and then some of the medical equipment. So therefore, with the encouragement of the government and the fact that firms may, in the short run, become more risk averse, they probably will try to diversify more across countries rather than putting all the baskets in one country like China. So I don't know whether I answer your question, but on the diversification discussion, I don't think my paper has much to say. There's a young professor at City University of Hong Kong who actually used the same shock that I use to understand, how firms that are more diversified during the epidemic tend to suffer less. Okay, but I don't think that particular paper shed light about policies or what is going to happen in the future. It's more like a positive analysis rather than a normative one. But I'm actually thinking hard about diversification and risk aversion for input sourcing these days.
Very good. Professor Paul Andrews?
Yeah, you hear me now, right?
Yep.
Yes.
Great. So, Heiwai, this was a great presentation, and I think it's great that you've done this. It's certainly the type of evidence that we need now to kind of try to understand the future of global value chains and of trade more broadly. The follow-up question I had is, when I think about COVID, it's a multidimensional shock, right? So, and you had it in the early slides. Why do we think there might be an impact on trade? Part of it might be demand shocks. Part of it might be international travel, business travel. So the question I have is there a way that you can leverage the nature of your shock to try to disentangle these effects? That is, it would seem to me that because the shock was more localized and it was only impacting, it wasn't impacting, say, Europe or North America, that the demand side is a little bit more isolated. So is there anything you can do to zoom in on the business travel side, maybe leveraging air travel or high-speed train or anything like that would sort of help us figure out to what extent these future disruptions in business travel are likely to impact trade flows, for which we have some evidence, but it's perhaps not as clean or related to pandemics as your evidence would be.
That was a great question, Paul. I have been talking to Heiwai Tang, who was Kalina Manova's student in London, and I mean, for several months, even before the current pandemic. So he has some data on air business travels in China, even going back to the days in 2003. So in that sense, we could actually have more continuous measures about sort of the disruption of business travels at the region level in China. So that helps on sort of fine-tuning the shock and sort of forcing us to focus more on the disruption of business travels and therefore the effect on trade. But the other side that we need is sort of some measure on face-to-face interactions or basically sectoral characteristics that we know are going to be affected more by business travel disruption. So I guess some of my product characteristics that I explore would be already useful, right? Differentiated products, and obviously there are tons of proxies about face-to-face interactions, and I can even try to use some task measures put together by David Alter to have some more micro-founder measures of sector characteristics. So that would be a potential second paper to follow up, focusing only on the additional effects due to international travel disruptions. But besides that, it would be very hard to go beyond, sort of this difference in difference analysis. I don't know what you have in mind, but to take it to a more structural, more macro level requires more data, I guess. Including maybe domestic production or domestic travels. Those data I may not have for that period.
Yeah, no, I didn't have in mind anything structural. Just, I mean, to the extent you can get some data that might speak more directly to some of these mechanisms, that I think that would be very interesting.
Yeah.
But it seems like you're already thinking about it, so that's great.
Great, thanks for your suggestion.
So Heiwai, do you have anything to say about more thing about trade? You're an expert, and China trade and Hong Kong's. So do you see any long-term effect? So company survival in some company exposure to previous SARS, did they survive more during current COVID-19?
I mean, we just had 12 cases here in Hong Kong yesterday after almost a month of 0 case. So I guess, this coronavirus is very unpredictable, and it will always come back, at the moment when people try to enjoy lives a little bit and relax. But what I can say, based on, now I'm based in Hong Kong, and, I can tell that people in Hong Kong are very patient. Part of the reason is because of their bad experience in SARS. I mean, I didn't have time to talk about Hong Kong because this paper is mostly about mainland China. But in fact, half of the death happened in Hong Kong in 2003, given that, Hong Kong is so small. So, this long-term memory are still in the mind of Hong Kong's people. But in terms of sort of the post-pandemic world, and I'm sure many people have talked about this already, this is just sort of the trade version of increased inequality that we're going to see after everything is going to be settled. So I don't know, on the trade side, what governments can do, and I'm sure the World Bank or the WTO have already had serious policy discussions about, how subsidies need to be provided to small firms, and how to improve trade facilitation so the SMEs are not going to be excluded in the pandemic.
Okay, thank you very much. Firstly, let me thank all the participants far away and early morning in US, and also, for people in China very late. And thank again for Professor Heiwai Tang. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And we're looking forward to the next webinar seminar by Graduate Institute and CEPR.